I remember the weight of that October afternoon, how the mist clung to everything like unfinished thoughts. I had been standing there for 20 minutes, maybe longer, watching the ocean disappear and reappear through veils of drizzle. The bus shelter behind me offered refuge, but I stayed in the rain. I needed to feel something other than the numbness that had followed me from Boston. The phone call from the lawyer had been brief. Clinical. My mother's house would be sold within the month. Someone needed to handle her belongings. Elaine had looked up from her crossword puzzle and told me to take care of it. She said it with that gentle efficiency she had perfected over 25 years of marriage. Kind but distant. Always distant. So here I was, back in Dovewell after 3 decades. The town looked smaller than I remembered, grayer. The edges had worn soft, like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. My black coat hung heavy with rain, and I could feel water seeping through the wool, finding my skin. I had taken off my wedding ring somewhere between the airport and the rental car. It sat now in my coat pocket, a small circle of gold that felt heavier than it should. I lit a cigarette more out of habit than desire. The flame flickered in the damp air, and I knew I would not finish it. I never did anymore. It was just something to do with my hands when the stillness became too much. That is when I saw him, or rather, felt him. The way you sense someone watching you across a crowded room. Except this room was empty, and the watching had been going on for 30 years. Julian stood inside the bus shelter, his silhouette familiar even through the gathering fog. Older now, grayer, but unmistakably him. The same way of holding his shoulders, the same tilt to his head when he was thinking. He had not moved when he saw me. Neither had I. We acknowledged each other with a nod. Nothing more. What do you say to someone who used to know the exact pitch of your breathing when you slept? How do you bridge decades of careful silence with small talk about the weather? The rain began to fall harder. Fat drops that struck the pavement like decisions being made. I took one last drag of my cigarette and dropped it, watching the ember hiss against the wet concrete. Then I stepped into the shelter. We stood close now. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, different from what he used to wear, but somehow still essentially him. Close enough to count the lines around his eyes, to notice the way his hair had gone silver at the temples. Close enough to remember everything I had spent half my life trying to forget. He told me he had heard about my mother. I said I was sorry about his. We spoke in careful sentences, each word measured and safe. But underneath the politeness, something else was moving. Something that had been waiting in the space between us for 30 years. And then, without warning or explanation, he leaned forward. Not for a kiss. Not for anything I could name. Just forward, until his forehead touched mine. Skin against skin. History pressing itself into the present moment. We stayed like that as the rain drummed against the shelter's plastic roof. 2 middle-aged men standing in the growing dark, connected by nothing more than memory and the weight of all the things we had never said. I closed my eyes and felt 17 again. Felt the summer we never spoke of pressing against my eyelids like light. My name is Nathaniel Reese. I am 47 years old. I teach 19th century literature at a small college outside Boston, where I have worked for the past 15 years. These are the facts I recite when people ask who I am. Though they tell you nothing about the man standing in this bus shelter, feeling the ghost of another man's forehead against his own. The life I built in Boston is careful and contained. Every morning at 6:30, I make coffee in our pristine kitchen while Elaine showers upstairs. The sound of water through pipes has become the soundtrack to my mornings. I read the newspaper at our breakfast table, a mahogany piece we bought during our first year of marriage when we still believed in the theater of domesticity. She comes down at 7, already dressed for her job at the museum, her graying hair pinned back with the same silver clip she has used for a decade. We speak in pleasant murmurs about schedules and grocery lists. She asks if I remember to grade my midterms. I ask if her sister is still planning to visit next month. These conversations feel scripted, performed for an audience that stopped watching years ago. My students see me as Professor Reese, the one who can make them understand why Wuthering Heights matters, who speaks about passion with the detached authority of someone who has studied it extensively but never quite lived it. I stand before them in my pressed shirts and wool blazers, discussing the destructive power of love while my own heart beats quietly in my chest like a clock running down. Elaine and I have 2 daughters, both grown now. Sarah works in Chicago and calls every Sunday evening. Emma is finishing her residency in Seattle and sends postcards with pictures of mountains and brief updates written in her careful handwriting. When they visit, the house fills briefly with laughter and the chaos of real life. But when they leave, the silence settles back over us like dust on furniture. Our home is beautiful in the way that carefully curated spaces often are. Neutral colors, tasteful art, books arranged by subject and then by height. Everything has its place, including us. Elaine moves through the rooms with practiced efficiency, maintaining the order we have created. I retreat to my study most evenings, grading papers or preparing lectures, while she watches television in the living room. We exist in parallel lines, never quite intersecting. She loves me. I know this the way you know the sun will rise tomorrow. Not because you feel it, but because it has always been true. She loves me the way she loves the house we share and the life we have built together. Faithfully, responsibly, but without the kind of passion that leaves marks on your soul. When the phone rang that Tuesday morning, I was grading essays on The Great Gatsby. Elaine answered and called me to the kitchen with that particular tone she uses for serious matters. The lawyer's voice was brisk and professional. My mother had been gone for 6 months, but the estate was finally ready to be settled. Someone needed to come to Dovewell and handle the house. Someone needed to decide what to keep and what to let go. I had not been back to Dovewell since my father's funeral 8 years ago. Even then, I stayed only long enough for the service, driving back to Boston the same day. Elaine suggested I take a few days, handle everything properly. She said it with the same gentle distance she applied to most aspects of our life together. So I drove north, through small towns that looked exactly as they had 30 years ago, following a coastal highway that curved like a question mark toward my childhood. The rental car smelled like artificial pine and someone else's coffee. I kept the radio off and listened instead to the sound of tires on wet pavement, to the rhythm of rain against the windshield. My mother's house sits on Maple Street, 3 blocks from the ocean. It is a small Cape Cod with blue shutters and a front porch that sags slightly on the left side. The key was where the lawyer said it would be, under the ceramic frog my mother placed by the front door 20 years ago. Walking inside was like stepping into a photograph of my past. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Her reading glasses on the kitchen table beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. A coffee mug in the sink with a faint ring of brown at the bottom. The smell of her lavender sachets mixed with salt air and something deeper, something that might have been loneliness. I moved through the rooms like a stranger in my own history. My childhood bedroom, with its single bed and faded baseball posters. The living room where we used to watch television together on Sunday nights. The kitchen where she taught me to make her famous blueberry pancakes, a recipe I have never shared with anyone. It was in my old bedroom that I found them. While moving my childhood desk to reach a box of photographs, I noticed that one of the floorboards had worked loose over the years. Underneath, wrapped in plastic and tied with a string, were the letters. Dozens of them, written on cream-colored stationery in my own handwriting. All addressed to Jay, all unsent, all dated from the summer I turned 18 and learned what it meant to want something so badly it changed the shape of your bones. I sat on the floor of that small room, holding 30 years of silence in my hands, and finally understood why I had never been able to love my wife the way she deserved. Some part of me had never left this house. Some part of me had been waiting all these years in a bus shelter, in the rain, for a moment that might never come. The morning after I found the letters, I walked downtown to the cafe where I used to spend my teenage afternoons. Murphy's Diner had not changed. The same cracked linoleum tiles formed a checkerboard pattern beneath my feet. The same red vinyl booths lined the windows. Even the menu, handwritten on a chalkboard behind the counter, looked exactly as it had 30 years ago. The waitress who approached my table was older, but familiar. Her name tag read, Dolores, the same woman who used to sneak me extra pie when my mother was working late at the library. She looked at me for a moment, her head tilted slightly, and then her face broke into a smile. Your little Nate Reese, she said. All grown up now. She poured coffee without asking, the same way she always had. I told her I was back to settle my mother's affairs, and she nodded with the understanding that comes from living your entire life in a small town where everyone's story eventually becomes everyone else's story. I sat by the window, watching Main Street wake up slowly. A few early shoppers moved between the stores that had survived the decades. The hardware store where my father used to buy fishing tackle. The post office with its faded American flag. The bookshop that looked smaller than I remembered, its windows filled with displays that had probably not changed since I was 17. That is when I saw him. Julian walked past the cafe window, moving with the same unhurried pace he had always possessed. His hair was flecked with gray now, silver threads catching the morning light. He carried a camera slung over one shoulder, an expensive-looking digital model that replaced the old film camera he used to carry everywhere. He wore dark jeans and a brown leather jacket that looked worn but well cared for. He glanced toward the window as he passed, and for a moment our eyes met through the glass. He did not stop, did not wave, just acknowledged me with the same slight nod we had exchanged at the bus shelter, then continued down the sidewalk until he disappeared around the corner by the old movie theater. I finished my coffee slowly, trying to process the strange mixture of familiarity and distance in that brief look. Dolores refilled my cup and asked if I was planning to stay in town long. I told her I was not sure yet, which was the first honest thing I had said to anyone in months. When I returned to the rental car, I found it. A piece of paper folded once and tucked beneath the windshield wiper. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as I remembered, though perhaps a little more careful now. The letters formed with the precision of someone who had learned to choose his words. Still raining, it said. You still hiding? It was signed simply with the letter J. I stood in the parking lot for a long time, holding that note while memories began to surface like objects floating up from the bottom of a deep pool. Late nights at the docks, when we should have been home sleeping. The way he used to sketch me while I read, his pencil moving across the paper in quick, confident strokes. The summer of 1995 when everything changed and nothing was ever spoken about it afterward. I remembered how he would lean against the pier railing, camera raised to capture the way the lighthouse beam swept across the water. How he would show me the developed photographs days later, pointing out details I had missed. The way his fingers would brush against mine when he handed me the prints. I remembered the night we almost kissed. The night his mother found us sitting too close together in his bedroom, looking at his photography portfolio. The way she had looked at us, understanding something we had not yet named ourselves. The way everything shifted after that, became careful and distant and eventually impossible. I drove out to the cliffs without deciding to do so. My hands seemed to know the way even after all these years. The road curved along the coastline, past houses that had been weathered silver by decades of salt spray. I pulled into the small gravel parking area where teenagers used to bring their dates, where Julian and I used to sit talking until the lighthouse beam swept across us like a searchlight finding its target. He was already there when I arrived, sitting on the stone barrier that separated the parking area from the drop-off to the rocks below. His camera sat beside him, and he was looking out at the ocean where storm clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon. I parked and walked over to him, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. He did not look up when I approached, but he spoke quietly, as if we had been in the middle of a conversation. I heard about your mother, he said. I'm sorry. I heard about yours too, I replied. We had both lost them within the past 2 years, those women who had shaped our childhoods and then watched us grow into men they could not quite understand. We talked carefully, like people walking on broken glass, about the weather, about how the town had changed and how it had stayed the same, about his photography business and my teaching job, safe topics that circled around the enormous fact of our shared history without ever landing on it. He told me he had stayed in Dovewell, had never really left except for a few years in art school. I told him about Boston, about my wife and daughters, about the life I had built that suddenly felt like a story I was telling about someone else. The storm clouds moved closer, and the first drops of rain began to fall. I expected him to leave, to suggest we continue the conversation somewhere dry. Instead, he pulled his jacket collar up against the wind and settled more firmly against the stone barrier. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and I understood that he was not talking about the rain. We sat there as the storm rolled in, two men in their late 40s finally acknowledging the summer that had changed everything. The summer we had spent 30 years pretending never happened. The rain began to fall harder, but neither of us moved. We had been hiding from this moment for too long to let a little weather drive us away now. After that afternoon at the cliffs, something shifted between us. Not dramatically, not in the way that movies would have you believe these things happen. It was more like ice beginning to thaw, so slowly you only notice it has happened when you realize you can finally move again. Julian left a message at my mother's house 3 days later. The old answering machine blinked red in the dim kitchen, and I stood there for several minutes before pressing play. His voice filled the empty rooms, careful but warmer than it had been at the cliffs. "There's something at the library you might want to see," he said. Saturday evening, 7 o'clock. I spent the next 2 days moving through my mother's belongings with mechanical efficiency, boxing up dishes and folding clothes for charity. But part of my attention remained fixed on Saturday evening, on whatever Julian wanted me to see. I had not realized how much I was anticipating it until Friday night, when I found myself choosing what to wear as carefully as I had once chosen outfits for faculty meetings where tenure decisions would be made. The Dovewell Public Library had been renovated since my childhood, but it still carried the same hushed reverence that all small-town libraries possess. The main reading room had been converted into a makeshift gallery space, with photographs mounted on portable panels arranged throughout the room. A small crowd had gathered, maybe 30 people, most of them faces I recognized from my youth but could not quite name. Julian stood near the back wall, speaking quietly with a woman who had once been our high school art teacher. He wore a dark blue shirt that brought out his eyes, and I noticed the way he gestured with his hands when he talked, the same animated movements I remembered from when we were 17, and he would explain the difference between aperture settings while we sat on the pier watching fishing boats return at sunset. The photographs were extraordinary, black and white images that captured something essential about coastal light, about the way fog transforms familiar landscapes into something mysterious and new. There were portraits of fishermen with faces carved by decades of salt wind, seascapes where the horizon dissolved into gray uncertainty, children playing on beaches that stretched beyond the frame like promises. But it was the photograph in the far corner that stopped me completely. I was looking at myself, but a version of myself from 30 years ago, 18 years old, sitting at the edge of the pier with my legs dangling over the water. My hair was longer then, falling across my forehead in a way I had forgotten. I was reading a book, completely absorbed, unaware that someone was capturing the moment. The late afternoon light caught the concentration on my face, the way I used to lose myself completely in whatever story I was reading. I stood in front of that image for a long time, feeling something tight and forgotten loosening in my chest. Other people moved around the gallery, their voices a soft murmur, but I could not look away from that boy who had become me, that moment when someone had seen me clearly enough to preserve it forever. Julian appeared beside me, not speaking at first. We looked at the photograph together, two middle-aged men studying the ghost of who I used to be. "I never asked if I could take that," he said finally. "I remember that afternoon," I replied. "You were supposed to be photographing the sunset." "I was," he said. "But then you sat down with that book, and the light was perfect, and you looked exactly like yourself. I could not capture it." We walked home separately that night, but the distance between us felt different now. Less careful, more like the natural space between two people who might walk together if circumstances were different. Over the next week, we began to meet more regularly. Not planned encounters, exactly, but moments that seemed to happen naturally. I would be sorting through my mother's books, and Julian would appear at the back door with coffee and an offer to help. I would take evening walks along the harbor, and he would fall into step beside me as if we had arranged it. His garage had been converted into a darkroom and studio space. The chemical smell of developer and fixer hung in the air, mixed with sawdust from the work table where he matted his prints. He showed me contact sheets from recent shoots, pointing out details the way he used to do when we were teenagers. His fingers would brush against mine as he handed me the magnifying glass, and neither of us would acknowledge the contact, but neither would we pull away. He remembered everything. The music I used to play on my Walkman during our long walks along the beach. The way I would unconsciously quote lines from whatever novel I was reading, working them into conversation as if they were my own thoughts. The poem I had scribbled in the margin of his chemistry notebook junior year, something about lighthouse beams and the spaces between words. "You still do that," he told me one afternoon as we walked past the bookshop that was closing after 40 years in business. "Quote things. You just quoted Yeats without realizing it." I had been talking about the town changing, about things falling apart, and apparently I had unconsciously borrowed from The Second Coming. The realization embarrassed me, the way it always did when someone caught me revealing more of myself than I intended. But Julian smiled when I apologized, the same smile I remembered from when we were 17, and he would catch me being more myself than I realized. "Some things don't change," he said. We spent an afternoon in that closing bookshop, helping the owner pack volumes that would be sold or donated. The familiar weight of books in my hands, the particular smell of aging paper and binding glue, reminded me why I had fallen in love with literature in the first place. Not for the analysis or the academic career it had provided, but for the way stories could make you feel less alone in the world. Julian watched me work, the same way he used to watch me read at the pier, with attention but without intrusion, as if he understood that some experiences were meant to be witnessed rather than shared. That night, alone in my mother's house, I found myself writing for the first time in years. Not lesson plans or conference papers, but actual writing. Words that came from some place deeper than my professional vocabulary. Sentences that tried to capture the exact quality of light filtering through fog. The way time seemed to move differently in this town where my past and present were colliding. I wrote about the photograph at the library, about the strange experience of seeing yourself as someone else once saw you. I wrote about the weight of unsent letters and the way some conversations can only happen after 30 years of silence. I wrote about the difference between the love that builds houses and the love that burns them down, and how sometimes you need both kinds to understand who you really are. The writing felt raw and dangerous, like blood returning to a limb that had been numb for too long. I filled pages in a composition notebook I found in my mother's kitchen drawer, my handwriting growing looser and more urgent as the words came faster. When Elaine called that Thursday evening, I was still writing. Her voice on the phone sounded distant in more ways than geography. She asked how I was managing with the house, whether I needed her to drive up and help with the sorting. She told me about her day at the museum, about a new exhibit they were planning, about Sarah calling to say she might visit for Thanksgiving. "When is this all going to be finished?" she asked, and I could hear the careful patience in her voice, the way she managed difficult situations by staying calm and reasonable. "Soon," I told her, the word coming automatically. But as soon as I said it, I knew I did not mean it. I was not ready to leave Dovewell yet. I was not ready to return to Boston, to my office with its neat stacks of papers and its window that looked out on a parking lot instead of an ocean. "I'm glad you're taking time to do this properly," she said. "It's important to say goodbye." But I was not saying goodbye. I was saying hello to parts of myself I had forgotten existed, parts that Julian seemed to recognize even when I could not. I was remembering what it felt like to want something beyond comfort and security, to feel my heart beat faster when someone looked at me in a certain way. After I hung up, I walked outside and stood in my mother's small backyard, looking up at stars that were clearer here than they ever were in Boston. The air smelled of salt and pine and something else, something that might have been possibility. In the distance, I could see the lighthouse beams sweeping across the water, steady and reliable, marking safe passage for anyone brave enough to navigate by its light. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, the kind of persistent coastal storm that makes the whole world feel underwater. I had been sitting in my mother's living room, trying to read, but finding myself staring at the same page for 20 minutes at a time. The words kept sliding away from me, replaced by fragments of memory and the sound of water against glass. Something was building inside me, some pressure I could not name. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing you need to jump, but unable to make your feet leave solid ground. Every conversation with Julian over the past 2 weeks had been circling something we could not quite say, and the weight of all those unspoken words was becoming unbearable. I found myself standing at my mother's front door at nearly 11 o'clock, car keys in my hand, not entirely sure how I had gotten there. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the streets into rivers that reflected the yellow glow of streetlights. I should have gone back inside, should have made tea and waited for morning to bring clarity and good sense. Instead, I drove across town to Julian's house. He lived in a small craftsman bungalow on Elm Street, 3 blocks from where he had grown up. I had driven past it several times during my stay, but never stopped, never allowed myself to imagine walking up those front steps. Now I sat in my rental car with the engine running and the windshield wipers beating their steady rhythm, looking at the warm light glowing behind his living room curtains. I knocked before I could change my mind. Soft at first, then louder when the sound was swallowed by the storm. When the door opened, Julian stood there in jeans and a gray sweater, his hair mussed as if he had been running his fingers through it. He looked at me for a long moment, taking in my soaked jacket and the wild look I must have had in my eyes. He stepped aside without speaking, and I walked into his house like a man stepping out of a 30-year storm. The living room was warm and cluttered in the way that homes are when someone actually lives in them rather than maintaining them. Books stacked on side tables, coffee cups that had not quite made it back to the kitchen, a guitar leaning against the wall, though I had never known Julian to play music. Photographs covered every available surface, some framed and some just propped against lamps and bookcases. He brought me a towel and took my wet jacket, hanging it over a kitchen chair to dry. The simple domesticity of these actions felt more intimate than anything we had shared as teenagers. I sat on his couch while he moved around the room, turning on a small lamp and adjusting the volume on an old stereo system. Music began to play softly, something instrumental and haunting that I recognized but could not place. He sat down beside me, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. We did not speak for several minutes. The music filled the space between us, and I found myself listening to the rain against the windows, to the quiet sounds of Julian's breathing, to the way the old house settled around us like something finding its balance. I told him I had been reading the letters I wrote, but never sent. The words came out quietly, barely audible over the music. I told him about finding them under the floorboard, about how strange it was to read your 18-year-old self trying to explain feelings he did not have names for yet. Julian nodded, but did not respond immediately. He was looking at his hands, at the way they rested on his knees, and I could see something working in his face, some decision being made. "I kept them too," he said finally. "The ones you did send. The ones you gave me and then asked me to forget." The room seemed to hold its breath. I had forgotten about those letters, the few I had actually been brave enough to hand him during those last weeks of summer. Letters that tried to say everything while saying nothing, that danced around the truth we both knew but could not acknowledge. He got up and walked to a bookshelf, returning with a small wooden box that looked like it had once held jewelry. Inside were my letters, yellowed with age but carefully preserved, along with photographs I recognized from our senior year. Pictures of us at the beach, at graduation, standing just far enough apart to look like friends instead of whatever we really were. The years collapsed between us then, not gradually, but all at once, like a wave breaking over rocks. I looked at him looking at those old photographs, and I could see the 18-year-old boy he had been, the one who had understood what I was feeling before I understood it myself. He reached out then, very slowly, and touched my face with the palm of his hand. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from years of working with cameras and developing chemicals. I closed my eyes and leaned into that touch, and felt something that had been frozen inside me for 30 years finally begin to thaw. When I opened my eyes, he was looking at me with an expression I remembered from all those years ago. The same look he used to give me when he thought I was not paying attention, when he thought it was safe to let his feelings show on his face. We moved toward each other then, drawn by a gravity that had been pulling at us since we were 17 years old. But instead of the kiss I expected, he pressed his forehead against mine. The same gesture he had made in the bus shelter that first day. Skin against skin, breath mixing with breath, the weight of 3 decades settling between us like something precious and fragile. I began to cry then. Not the careful, controlled tears I had learned to produce at appropriate moments, but something deeper and more raw. Grief for all the years we had lost, for the boy I had been who was too frightened to love the person who mattered most. Grief for the life I had built that felt suddenly like a beautiful cage, and for the man sitting beside me who had waited all this time without knowing if I would ever come back. Julian wiped my tears with his thumbs, his hands cupping my face like I was something that might break if handled too roughly. He did not try to stop my crying or tell me it was okay. He just held me while I fell apart, the way I had needed someone to hold me 30 years ago when I was 18 and terrified of who I might really be. Neither of us said the words. Neither of us said I love you, or I never stopped thinking about you, or I made the biggest mistake of my life when I let you go. But those words hung in the air between us anyway, as real as the rain still falling outside, as true as the fact that we were finally here in the same room, breathing the same air, no longer pretending that what had happened between us all those years ago was something we could continue to ignore. We stayed like that until the storm began to quiet, foreheads touching, hands intertwined. 2 men in their late 40s finally acknowledging what their 18-year-old selves had been too afraid to claim. I returned to Boston on a Tuesday morning in early November. The drive south felt like traveling through time in reverse, each mile taking me further from the man I had been in Julian's living room and closer to the careful professor who graded papers and attended faculty meetings and slept in a king-sized bed next to a woman who loved him faithfully, but without passion. Elaine was waiting for me in our kitchen when I arrived, sitting at the mahogany table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Next to her elbow sat a small stack of envelopes, all addressed in my own handwriting. Letters I had written to myself during those last few days in Dovewell, trying to capture what was happening to me, trying to make sense of the man I was becoming. She looked up when I walked in, and I saw something in her face I had never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of weary recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment far longer than I had realized. "You mailed these to yourself," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "From Dovewell." I set my suitcase down and sat across from her, the same position we had occupied for countless breakfast conversations over the years. But the distance between us felt different now, charged with the weight of everything I had never told her. "I read them," she continued, and I could hear the pain beneath her composure. "Not because I was trying to invade your privacy, but because they were addressed to our house, and they felt important, and you had been gone for 2 weeks longer than you said you would be." We looked at each other across the table, 2 people who had shared a life for 25 years finally seeing each other clearly. The letters contained everything I had been too afraid to say aloud. About Julian, about the summer that had shaped me in ways I was only now beginning to understand, about the hollow feeling that had lived inside my chest for so long I had forgotten it was not supposed to be there. "You've never really been here, have you?" she said finally, and the question landed with the weight of absolute truth. "Not completely. Not with all of yourself." The words hung between us like a bridge I could either cross or burn down. I thought about denying it, about trying to explain away what she had read, about protecting the careful life we had built together. But sitting there in our pristine kitchen, looking at the woman who had loved me as well as she knew how, I found I could not lie anymore. I told her about Julian, about the summer when I was 18 and learned what it meant to want someone so completely it felt like drowning, about the letters I had written but never sent, and the ones I had sent but asked him to forget, about the way I had buried that part of myself so deep that I convinced myself it had never existed. I told her about finding him again, about the way 30 years had collapsed the moment he touched my forehead with his, about the man I became when I was with him, someone I barely recognized, but who felt more real than the person I had been pretending to be for decades. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler as the truth finally took shape between us. When I finished talking, she sat quietly for several minutes, staring at the letters as if they contained answers to questions she had been asking herself for years. "I always knew something was missing," she said eventually. "I told myself it was just the way some men are, that not everyone loves the same way. But I knew." Our daughters came for dinner that weekend. Sarah drove up from Chicago with her new boyfriend, a kind man who worked in renewable energy and talked enthusiastically about wind farms. Emma flew in from Seattle, still pale from the long hours of her residency, but glowing with the satisfaction of work she loved. I could barely look at them during dinner. These two remarkable women who had grown up in our house, who had learned about love by watching Elaine and me navigate our careful, cordial marriage. What had we taught them about passion, about the kind of love that makes you willing to risk everything? What example had we set for how two people should be together? But after dinner, when Sarah had taken her boyfriend for a walk around the neighborhood and Elaine was loading the dishwasher, Emma came and sat beside me on the living room couch. She did not say anything at first, just leaned against my shoulder the way she used to when she was small and had nightmares. "Dad," she said quietly, "are you okay? You seem different." I started to give her the standard reassurance, to tell her I was just tired from dealing with my mother's estate. But then she looked at me with those dark eyes that had always been too perceptive for her own good, and I found myself telling her a version of the truth. "I'm figuring some things out," I said, "about who I am, about who I've always been." She nodded as if this made perfect sense to her, as if she had been waiting for me to acknowledge something she had understood long before I did. Then she hugged me, tighter and longer than she had in years, and I felt something break open inside my chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with love. The letter from Julian arrived 3 days after the girls had gone back to their lives. Not a letter, exactly, but a photograph in a manila envelope with no return address. It showed the bus shelter where we had first met again, empty now, rain pooling on the concrete where we had stood. On the back, in his careful handwriting, he had written only, "Still here." I stared at that photograph for a long time, thinking about everything it represented. The boy I had been who was too frightened to claim what he wanted most. The man I had become who had built a good life on the foundation of that fear. And the person I might still be able to become if I could find the courage to choose authenticity over safety. That night, I told Elaine I was going back to Dovewell. Not to see Julian, though I knew he was part of what was drawing me back, but to see myself clearly for the first time in 30 years, to stop running from the person I had always been too afraid to be. She nodded, her face sad but not surprised. We both knew our marriage had been built on the foundation of my inability to love her the way she deserved, and that no amount of goodwill or trying harder could fix something that fundamental. "Go," she said. "Find out who you really are. We both deserve that much." I left Boston the next morning, driving north through the early November landscape toward whatever was waiting for me in that small coastal town where I had first learned the difference between existing and living. The fog rolled in from the ocean on Thursday morning, thick and silver, transforming the familiar landscape into something soft and dreamlike. I had been back in Dovewell for a week, staying again in my mother's house while I decided what came next. The packing was nearly finished. Boxes lined the hallway, labeled in my careful handwriting: books, donate; kitchen, keep; photos, sort later. I walked to the pier alone, carrying the composition notebook I had been writing in since my return. Its pages were filled with everything I had never said, 30 years of buried thoughts finally given shape and substance. Letters to Julian that I might actually send this time. Letters to Elaine, thanking her for loving me as well as she could and apologizing for never being able to love her the same way in return. Letters to my daughters, trying to explain the father they had known and the man I was learning to become. But mostly, the notebook contained letters to myself, to the 18-year-old boy who had been too frightened to claim what his heart knew was true, to the 47-year-old man who had spent decades in a kind of emotional exile, loving carefully and safely, but never completely. The pier stretched out into the fog, its wooden planks slick with moisture. I could hear the ocean but could barely see it, just gray shapes moving in the distance that might have been waves or might have been clouds. This was where Julian used to photograph the sunrise, where we used to sit talking until the lighthouse beam swept across us like a blessing. I sat at the edge of the pier, my legs dangling over the dark water, and thought about the choices that had brought me here. The safe choice I had made at 18, running from love because it felt too big and too dangerous to contain. The comfortable life I had built in Boston, good and meaningful, but never quite real. And now, at 47, the possibility of choosing differently. When I finished reading through the notebook one last time, I walked to Julian's house. The same craftsman bungalow where he had held me while I cried, where I had finally stopped running from who I really was. I placed the notebook in a manila envelope along with something I had found in my mother's photo albums. A picture of Julian and me at 17, sitting on this same pier on a summer afternoon. We were not touching in the photograph, but we were leaning toward each other like flowers following the sun, and anyone who looked closely could see the love written in the space between us. I left the envelope in his mailbox without knocking, without waiting for an answer. Some conversations are too important for words, at least at first. Instead of leaving Dovewell, I found myself walking to the old bookshop that had been closing when I first returned. The "For Rent" sign still hung in the window, faded but readable. I called the number and arranged to see the small apartment above the shop, a space that had been used for storage but could easily become a home for someone who did not need much beyond books and quiet and a view of the harbor. The apartment was perfect in its simplicity. One bedroom, a kitchen just large enough for a table and 2 chairs, windows that faced east toward the ocean. I signed the lease that same day, shocking myself with how easy it was to choose this different life. I called the Dovewell Public Library and offered to teach writing workshops. The librarian, a woman my age who remembered me from high school, was delighted. They had been wanting to expand their programming, and a literature professor who was willing to work with adults who had stories to tell was exactly what they needed. I learned to make tea properly, something I had never bothered with in Boston, where coffee was king. Earl Grey in the mornings, chamomile in the evenings, and green tea in the afternoons when I sat at my small kitchen table, grading essays from students who were learning to find their voices on the page. My daughters called regularly, curious about my new life, but supportive in ways that surprised me. Emma said she had never heard me sound so alive, so present in my own life. Sarah drove up from Chicago one weekend and declared my apartment exactly right, as if she had been waiting for me to become someone she recognized. Elaine and I spoke once a week, careful conversations that grew warmer as the months passed. She was seeing a counselor, she told me, learning to understand her own role in our careful marriage. She had joined a hiking group and was considering taking pottery classes. We were both, it seemed, learning who we might be when we were not trying to be half of something that had never quite fit together properly. And sometimes, when it rained, Julian would appear beside me. Not at my door, not with explanations or dramatic gestures, but simply there. In the library during one of my workshops, sitting quietly in the back row. At the cafe where I had breakfast most mornings, reading a newspaper at the table by the window. Walking along the harbor path when I took my evening constitutional. We did not call it anything. Did not discuss what we were to each other or what the future might hold. We simply stopped hiding from the love that had been waiting patiently between us for 30 years, stopped pretending that what we felt was anything other than the deepest truth of our lives. One evening in March, as rain tapped against my kitchen window, Julian knocked softly on my door. I let him in without speaking, made tea for both of us, and we sat at my small table watching the steam rise from our cups. His hand moved slowly across the worn wood until his fingers found mine, and we stayed like that as the storm passed over us. 2 men who had finally learned that some kinds of love are worth waiting for, worth choosing, worth the risk of being completely, authentically yourself with another person. Outside, the lighthouse beams swept across the harbor, steady and sure, marking safe passage for anyone brave enough to navigate by its light.